Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third Accessibility Manchester event. I'm Becky Tops, and tonight the theme is Nothing About Us Without Us, challenging companies and assistive technologies to do better. So firstly, we just want to extend a big thank you to all our speakers for taking the time to put together their presentations and record the videos that we are doing tonight. And we know how busy you are, and it wouldn't be possible without you. We also, secondly, want to give a massive thank you to the cooperative for the Zoom account, and also Clear Text for sponsoring the event and for doing the live captions tonight that you should be able to see on screen. So just quickly, before we start the talks, I'm just going to go over what's happening today. So the talks are going to be around 60 minutes. We are really excited for these talks, and they're really people I consider friends of mine. And we have Florian Byers, who is a lead coder at Iron Realms Entertainment, talking about the impact of using inaccessible tools in a development team. Dawn Collette, a DevOps engineer from Dover, who's speaking about how to build a culture of accessibility at your company. And Ben Mustel-Rose, who is a software engineer on BBC iPlayer, who's speaking about when big tech tries to make assistive technologies, were we better off without you? After the talks, we're going to have a quick 10-minute break, and then we're going to go into a Q&A at the end. For the questions in the Q&A, you can kind of, give your questions in Slido. So to go to Slido, you just put sli.do in your browser, and where it says enter event name, just write accessibility. And in there, you can put any questions that you have for our speakers. If you have specific questions for speakers, just write their name so that we know who that question is for. So then when I'm asking people the questions, I know who to direct it to as well. There is also a chat, as you probably know, on YouTube, so you can chat in there and put any questions. I think some of the speakers may be, looking at the chat in there as well. But for the main questions for the panel, just put them into Slido. And finally, just a quick code of conduct. You can also read the full code of conduct in the description in YouTube. But it is be inclusive, be respectful, be kind, and be open to feedback. Don't be offensive and don't discriminate against anyone as well. So we're going to go into our first speaker, Florian Byers, who is a lead coder at Iron Realms Entertainment. So I'm going to pass over to Stu now, just to kind of start the videos.
Really sorry, I'm just going to have to quit. You have to take control back, Becky, 1 second.
Are you making me host, Stu?
Yes, sorry, just 1 second.
Okay. No. Okay. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so while Stu's doing that, I'll just kind of introduce Florian. So Florian is a 28-year-old jack of all trades from the Netherlands. He mostly freelances as a web developer, as well as an accessibility auditor and consultant. Oh.
Becky, can you let Stu in?
Yeah, sure. And record the video.
My name is Florian. I am in the Netherlands. I'm a 28-year-old developer. I am fully blind, and I've been working as a developer for sighted developer teams for the last 4 or so years. I also do a lot with cybersecurity, languages, and audio engineering. And I am also an accessibility consultant. So that's a lot of hats I wear, but it seems to work for me so far.
Thank you. And how do you find working like in a development team?
It's been a learning curve. I've been doing this, like I said, for a couple of years now, and what I found is that it takes a lot of figuring things out, often things that really only you can figure out, or you can figure out with people that have the same challenges as you do. Asking my direct colleagues how to do certain things may not always work very well because they just don't know and can't really imagine the way I work, which is definitely something that I have had to come to grips with. Like, there are communities of blind programmers out there. There's a mailing list, and there's some other things that you can go to get some help. But I found out over the years that often when it's like a really specific thing, I'm usually on my own, and that's worked for me so far. What that does mean, though, is that you have to spend in your own time or the boss's time when they let you to basically get the tools you need to be as efficient as possible. And what's important there as well is that the company needs to allow you to bring your own tools, which is mostly the case for developer teams, but can sometimes not be, especially tools like issue trackers, ticketing systems, things that the entire company uses. If there is no other way than to use those tools, and those tools are not accessible, that is a problem. And that is something I've found you need to figure out before you even start the onboarding process, because if that doesn't work properly, what happens is that you're pretty much just on the back foot from day one, and you have to figure out some way of compensating for that. And sometimes there just isn't a way to compensate. Like, if a ticketing system is being used that just isn't accessible, then you're always going to have to ask your colleague to email you the relevant details for a particular ticket you're working on. And some colleagues will be fine doing that, and some people will not. It really depends also on like how time crunched the company is, how big the company is, what kind of colleagues you're working with. So that is definitely something you have to keep an eye on. And if that doesn't work, you will be in for a really bad time. So having learned all that, my questions during interviews have changed quite a bit. When I first started out, I was very simple in the sense that what I would do is I would come in and I would ask what they worked on, how they worked. And if I liked all that, then it sounded perfect. And now I have to ask them if I am able to use my own tools, what tools they are using, if they know, if it's a tool that I don't know, if they know if it's accessible or not. And if they don't know, I'm going to have to go home, Google, check how bad it is, because generally that's how I have to look at things. Usually it's not good. And we have to figure out how not good it is before I can make the call on, am I going to work for this company or not? This is actually something I have to keep in mind. I have worked with a content management system last year, for example, that just wasn't very accessible. And part of my work during during that brief stint I worked at that particular company was making that tool more accessible. And fortunately, the company I worked at let me do that. But if they didn't, I would have had no way to actually properly work at this company. And the final minefield is that when something is accessible, it's very easy to not be accessible anymore because someone figured out an update that would make things, quote, better, quote, and then broke the entire experience for screen reader users, because we are currently still a minority, which is unfortunate. And it also makes it really hard to make the creators of these tools consider us a target audience of priority, which we often are not. I've had reactions anywhere ranging from like, okay, sure, we'll fix this for you, to how do you even use a computer, and anything in between. So it's really, yeah, it can be a minefield. Postman is a tool that, for example, promises to do better, and then now there's an issue open for accessibility improvements. It's been open for years, literally to 4 years or something. And still I see people commenting on it that really want Postman to be more accessible. And there's just no more interaction from them at all whatsoever these days. It's gotten so bad that I am in the issue on the Postman repo. I'm referring people to other tools because I'm the only person who seems to really care all that much to get these people unstuck. This is how it goes.
And what are you mentioned like other tools and recommending other tools. What different tools would you kind of, recommend to use, especially around like the issue tracking side of things as well, that are more accessible?
It can really depend on the tool. Sometimes, for example, for chat apps, there may be a bridge to another chat application that works better. I remember using IRC Cloud for Slack a while when Slack wasn't very accessible. This was back in 2017. Slack is actually pretty usable these days. So that is a way you can use some third party to interact with the first party that your company is working with, and that is usually sort of along the tune of how it usually goes. Like if, for example, a issue tracker isn't accessible, what you can try is to see if someone has written a command line client for it, which can make things easier. It can also make things harder, and sometimes you don't have access to all the features you would want to have access to, or even need to have access to. In that case, yeah, it's a problem, and it's maybe an unsolvable problem depending on how bad the deficiencies are. But yeah, you would find a different client to interact with the same tools that everyone else is using, be it a different chat application, be it a command line client, be it a different web front end for a certain thing. For example, sometimes there can even be plugins for certain things. I'm pretty sure that some issue trackers have an accessibility plugin in the marketplace. If I'm not terribly mistaken, Atlassian does. I don't actually know what this plugin does, because I'm pretty sure it has to be implemented by the owner of the platform. And I actually don't know what it does. I know it exists. I think it makes things a little bit better, but I don't know exactly what it does. So that might be an option. Another big problem area is Amazon Web Services.
Yeah.
Amazon Web Services is barely usable for people who can see. The dashboards are all over the place, and it's just a UI nightmare for as far as I've heard from other people. And unfortunately, that also reflects in the accessibility of it. Some little windows are very usable, others are really not. Some basic tasks that should take 5 seconds just are impossible to do from the UI. And there are, fortunately, command line scripts that you can use to automate or do a lot of these tasks from the command line, but that is not always very easy to pick up. Like usually what happens is that the arguments for these tools are not very well documented, or they're different from what the sighted user would be using in the regular UI. So you have like a different tool to learn. And yeah, that just makes for a frustrating learning experience, and it's very different from what your colleagues are doing. So you're essentially on your own. learning this whole new way of interacting with the tool that everybody else is using, and you can't ask for help from your colleagues because they literally have no idea what it is you're doing. So yeah, that happens.
And what impact does this have on you when, like you mentioned, working with your colleagues? So what impact does it have on you when working with your colleagues and people on your team?
It really varies on the company. It really depends on the company where that's concerned. It can be extremely stressful. You're essentially not as efficient as your colleagues, which means you might get booted out. This does happen. It shouldn't, but it does. Mm-hmm. If that doesn't happen, you'll have to like depend on your colleagues to do certain things. And if you're in a cool team, that really isn't the problem. Like I've been in teams where, for example, a lot of front end visual stuff needs to be done, and I can just offload that on one of my team members, and they'll happily do it. It does mean that I have to pick up their slack for the back end development that I can do. And if that can be properly divided, it's fine. But that doesn't always work, especially in a bigger company where splintered teams work on very specific things. It can be harder to get that arranged. You'd think a smaller team is easier for this, but a smaller team also means reduced capacity, and that can mean that things just don't work as well as they should be. It really depends on like how willing your colleagues are to cooperate with you. And I've been on the other side too. I've been in companies where people had me do the front end visual stuff, and that is just not a good combination. It makes me very aware of what I can do, and that can be quite the blow for your self-confidence, for the overall way you feel, because you're essentially slogging through what should be a simple task, and it's tricky to keep momentum going and to actually enjoy the work you're doing, because you're essentially doing busy work and barely at that, and it can be very stressful. It can be very tiring to do that, and at some point it can really be an energy hog to have to deal with all that on top of your regular work.
And what do you think some solutions are for this? What do you think companies can be doing, to make things more accessible and make sure that the tools are more accessible as well?
It's a very multifaceted problem. What happens is that companies often don't know any better. Like when you start working at a company and they use a tool, they don't have the governance to change the accessibility on that tool most of the time. They can maybe exercise some clout by saying to this tool's developer, look, we're a company that's like, you're a customer essentially, and there's a person here who has a need for accessibility that you guys are not satisfying, and it needs to change. And they might or they might not, but the real issue lies with both the image that a lot of people have of a person with a disability, as well as the priority for accessibility fixes. Like, if I have to explain to a developer-centric tool that yes, I can use a computer and I'm actually a developer, then that conversation of can you make it so I can actually use your tool properly is a very hard one to defend. People barely understand that I'm able to open my laptop, let alone do sophisticated development work. And if you're at that stage in a process, it can take months, sometimes even years to get things rolling properly. And you don't have months and years. This is how people lose their jobs. And it can be any company. There are companies that are sort of famous for this. JetBrains has been very inaccessible consistently for a long time. And I hear they're cleaning up their act a little bit now. I do not use the tools they create because I tend to use open source alternatives, but they do have some improvement. It's still not great, but it's better. But also Microsoft, who is now very much pushing on accessibility, used to be way worse at this. They managed to actually completely break the Premiere Visual Studio IDE for a long time, making it almost impossible to use for blind programmers. If that happens on a job and I am working with that tool and my company decides to upgrade to the newest version, which is inaccessible, that essentially means I might get fired. And, at that point, you're one developer in the Netherlands trying to appeal to a huge company in Redmond, US, and I have been there. They know my face. So I have that going for me. I know some of the people who work on that tool now, if they're still there, but that is me, and that might not be some other developer. So if you don't know who to talk to, it might take years for your stuff to get back into a usable state. Even right now, Visual Studio 2019, although we have a very responsive person on the programming list for the blind developers who really takes in feedback and tries to run with it, it's still a very large multidisciplinary product that a lot of people work on. So it can take a really long time for accessibility fixes to actually make it. And they have a lot of legacy code to work with to actually get these fixes in the door, which just means it's not the quickest process ever. And yeah, if you have to wait months and months for your main tool of choice to be accessible, then yeah, that might cost you jobs. In fact, that will cost you your job because you can't do your work. And that is something I think a lot of companies just don't realize. Like, not doing accessibility or no longer doing accessibility can literally ruin someone's career. And like, I think it really sometimes needs to sink in with developers that happens and that needs to stop. I have been going around the world essentially, talking to people, showing to people just how accessibility issues can literally negatively impact your work or even completely make it impossible. And I've actually given a presentation on Visual Studio in 2016, and a lot of things got fixed as a result of that. So that's definitely good, and I really enjoy doing that. I really enjoy helping people along that path. But the truth is that I really shouldn't have to.
And the last question, what do you think colleagues and managers could do, to support people on their team who may use like assistive technology, or need tools and things like that are more accessible?
I think managers mostly can talk to the person in question. Like, it's very much a communication game. Yeah. If a tool doesn't work, well, that's not the colleagues' fault. Like, they can't help that, and they can only really work within the framework that they have freedom of movement in. So the colleagues often have to have some kind of way to sort of communicate about what the challenges are and how we can best sort of solve them, overcome them. And that really depends on what kind of work you do. Managers will often shy away from this topic. Don't try to just talk with the person in question, see what solutions the two of you can come up with. If that means using a different tool for that particular person, then that's what it means. If that means giving this person some extra time to learn to operate a third-party tool that still lets them participate in whatever it is that the other people are doing, then give them that time, because they can definitely be as efficient, just in a different way, if they're given that kind of time. And they shouldn't have to fight for that kind of time, because that should be a given. It's not something you can help, but it's definitely something you can sort of work with. And as for tools, OSs, development tools, things like that, definitely allow the person that comes to work for you to pick their own tools. If it's just something they will be using and they can still interact with whatever the company is doing, let them pick their own tools, because we know what works and what doesn't work. And having a company like assign us a particular IDE or a particular way to use Git or a particular way to use Windows or Mac OS or Linux or whatever other OS you can think of, that's not going to work like 95% of the time. Like, if I have to use a certain tool and the tool's not accessible, then the tool isn't helping me, the tool is getting in my way. And in that sense, I'm being less efficient. And if I can fix that deficiency by using a different tool, then give me that freedom. And most companies do. Some companies do not. They can have a number of reasons: security, just pride into a certain way of doing things. Don't do that. Make sure that people have breathing room and like freedom of movement to pick their own tools, because, like I said, generally we know what works, and managers / colleagues will most likely not know.
Organization. And great.
Thanks, Stu. So our next speaker is Dawn Collette, who is a DevOps and site reliability engineer. She started out as a freelance developer and realised that learning about infrastructure and release systems would save time and money for everyone involved. As well as an accidental accessibility advocacy, Dawn is on the organising team for the Melbourne AWS Programming and Tools Meetup, and can regularly be found sharing knowledge with the Melbourne Cloud Infrastructure and DevOps communities. Thanks, Stu. So if I've started a new job and no one knows anything about accessibility, how do I build a culture of accessibility at my workplace?
That is a really hard question, and it's a question with many answers. But at the end of the day, and spoiler alert, because this will also be the end of the talk, it basically comes down to listening to people and getting everyone in the room. And so the first thing that you have to do, if you want to build a culture of accessibility at your workplace, task one is to get everybody interested. And depending on where you're working, that will mean different things. Because in a workplace, as IT-related workplaces tend to be, where everyone is heavily analytical, that will be about getting people interested in solving the problem. Hey, we have a bunch of users that can't use our software. How can we fix that problem? And then your hook for the engineers is, hey, here's a problem. Let's sit down and actually solve it. Whereas if you're talking to people like product managers, say, often the hook will be money. And as much as I hate having to make this case, it is a reality of the world that sometimes you do have to sit down and make the case to product managers that, yes, this is worth doing, because either it will save us money in terms of us meeting compliance requirements and not being sued for it, or it will make us more money in terms of broadening its user base. Additionally, if you're dealing with a group of people like, say, doctors or nurses or childcare workers, where accessibility might be about more practical things like getting people into the building, it becomes about building a culture of empathy. And that is very much then about, hey, how would you feel if you were the person in my situation and you were locked out like this? But that is a very difficult task, because often you'll come up against lots of barriers that people will throw up. You might find that the doctors and nurses and childcare workers are slightly less empathetic than you thought they would be. You might find that the engineers aren't so interested in solving accessibility problems. They're more interested in solving problems like, how do we make this product look shiny? And you might find that the product managers think that the margin of money that they would get out of improving the reach of their product, or indeed the risk of being sued, is so small as to not be worth focusing on it. And at that point, it becomes a more difficult task. One thing that I've had success with, actually, is in getting people to think differently about the hiring process. Because some workplaces are very homogenous, but no matter how homogenous your workplace is, you'll often have people with disabilities there already. You just might not know it. And the best example of this is 5% of the population, mostly men, are colorblind. Do you really think that in a workplace of 1,000 or 2,000 people, you'd have no colorblind people in there? So if you know what to look for, you can start finding those people, as subtle as their challenges might be, you can start finding the people who have accessibility challenges and getting them along with you to start the conversation. So, hey, this software engineer is colorblind and can't use our product because we've got red and green with no colorblind mode, is a far more effective hook than just having it in the abstract and saying, yes, there are people here who wouldn't be able to use our software because of that. And that brings me to the hiring process, because as far as I'm concerned, the one thing that you can do to really build a culture of accessibility in your workplace is to start hiring people who are different. And that doesn't even just mean disabled people. But if you have a hiring process, and if you're part of the hiring process, think about, how can we get different people in? How do we make sure that not every candidate coming through the door looks the same? And rather than just having a generic accessibility statement on your website, on your hiring pages, if you want to have people with disabilities come in and work for you, how do you make the hiring process accessible? Can your technical tests be done by screen reader users, for example? If you have to have video interviews, as many people do these days, is the video conferencing tool that you're using accessible to someone who's, say, deaf or hard of hearing? Would a deaf person who speaks sign language be able to bring their interpreter along to the interview? And these are very important questions to consider, because a lot of this is about getting a critical mass of people into your organization who are interested. And if you're able to hire people with disabilities in, and your colleagues see the value and the benefit that they can bring to the organization, suddenly that case becomes a hell of a lot easier to make. Once you've started thinking about that, and once you've started breaking down barriers in the hiring process, it becomes about getting everyone to the table and having those discussions. So your engineers or your doctors or your nurses or your childcare workers or your product managers, your people on the front line, are now interested in accessibility. You've changed your hiring process so that you can get more people with disabilities to come into the organization and bring that perspective. And then it becomes about several things. But the thing that I would generally start with here is the idea of building empathy for people. And even though I'm not a screen reader user, my favorite tool for this is to get out the black fabric, cover up the screen of your QAs, give them a list of screen reader commands and say to them, all right, we're going to go through your website with a screen reader today, and we're going to see how good the user experience is. One thing that I found really effective at my previous job when I was doing this with the QAs was to get them to actually write down a list of everything that they could see with the screen reader on the screen. And then when we took away the black fabric and saw what the website actually looked like, to compare the list of what they had seen through audio to what they could see visually. Were there any large chunks of information that were missing? Would they have been able to understand how to navigate around the website? Would they have been able to understand form input? And interestingly enough, as much as I often hate that thing of trying to build empathy with people, once you get the light bulb moment with your devs or your QAs and they go, this is what the experience would be like if someone who was blind or visually impaired or someone else who used a screen reader was trying to actually go to our website and buy our product. That's when they realize, okay, we need to fix something about this. Another effective tool that you can use here is colorblind filters. So if you put a colorblind filter over web pages, particularly if you've got a colorblind person sitting right there, often, again, that will be a tool to get people talking about, oh, we have a lot of red and green here, and we're not actually providing icons. If I was colorblind, would I know whether that button that I was about to click was the OK button or the cancel button? Because if not, you're a bit stuck. And then from there, the sort of thing about getting people into a room is then that you have to get everyone into a room and have that discussion about how do we make it better? What are we doing wrong? Okay, so we've identified the problem space, but then what are the goals that we could come to as an organization or as people dealing with these products to actually make that product more usable and more workable for people with disabilities? And that can be super incremental. The first stage of that plan could be something as simple as, okay, we've identified that we've got these red and green buttons. Let's add some icons to them. Or, okay, we've got this form input that goes red or green depending on whether the input is valid or not. Let's add text to explain what that's doing. Or, okay, we've got this large chunk of text on our website that's not being read by screen readers. Let's actually make sure as a priority that we go away and fix that. And part of the key of this, particularly when you're coming into an organization where accessibility hasn't really been a thing, is don't treat it as a monolith. Don't treat it as something where we're going to do accessibility. We're going to sit down and we're going to have everyone in a room and we're going to all spend 4 weeks in a room and we're going to do accessibility, because it does not work like that. The best thing that you can do in terms of getting people on board is to show them how to make those small incremental changes that will make things easier, but also to show them how simple those changes can be. It could be, depending on your build process, it could be 2 or 3 hours of development time. If you have really good CI/CD, from, okay, we have this issue with icons that are only giving information using color, let's fix that, to, hey, we've got that fix pushed up to production. And if you can show people that it will be frictionless, that's a huge step towards getting people to take accessibility seriously. So you've gone through, you've got people on board, you've built the plan, and you've started to make some of those small bug fixes. So the next step then from there is integrating accessibility into your broader workflow. And the interesting thing, well, interesting and kind of sad thing about this is that this is something that really needs a critical mass of people in the organization on board. And I can speak to personal experience here in saying that even with a lot of super passionate, engaged people who are really serious about doing this well, sometimes the change has to come from the top, and it can be really hard and it can be really slow. So I've actually never got to the stage of putting this into practice, but I came close. And so my next thing then would have been to talk about how you integrate accessibility into your workflow really early on. And part of that, as I said, is about the hiring process. Because if you have, a blind QA who uses a screen reader, or if you have a very annoying person, me, who needs all of their screens zoomed in and complains about it all of the time, then that's going to surface those issues a lot earlier. If you have people in your actual development team with accessibility requirements, you're going to know day one if something's not working. Oh, it's not in the design plan. We need to make sure that we have screen readers in the design plan. Or, okay, we've just sat down to start coding this and I'm colorblind and I can't see any of the text. But the other part of it then becomes about getting the non-disabled people in your organization, and they will almost always be a majority, to sit down and do that integration really early in the piece. So can we talk to disabled users about what they would need to make this work? Okay, we know that, say, 5% of our user base is colorblind. Let's go and have a chat to them about what we need to do. Okay, we know we've got this group of screen reader users who've come and raised issues with us before. Can we leverage that and say to them, all right, we're happy to give you, some free beta access to our new product if you will sit down with us and give us some feedback on how that works for screen reader users. And that is a really powerful tool, because you can integrate accessibility into the design process all you want, but if it becomes something then that falls by the wayside, which frequently it does, having that input from people really early on in the development phase will help to keep you on track. And then make sure that you've got a diverse range of QAs. Make sure that you're doing that user acceptance testing. QAs with accessibility requirements themselves, in my opinion, are probably one of the most powerful tools that you can have in terms of pushing accessibility in an organization. And I really wish that people took that into account more. But if you can't do that, then as you're developing the project, sit down and do user research. Get some people with disabilities in, pay them for their time, because paying people for their time is really important, and say to them, okay, does this work for you? What doesn't work? What can we change? Because the earlier in the process that you know that, the less likely you end up with a final product that just doesn't work at all. And then something that could have taken you 2 or 3 extra weeks to integrate during the development process potentially ends up taking you months or even years to resolve. But the real key to this is that change has to come from both the bottom and the top. And that means that you have to have both really passionate people pushing accessibility on the ground and also buy-in from the senior leaders in your organization. Because if you have those really passionate people on the ground, and yet the senior leaders in your organization are bean counters who don't realize the value of accessibility, then your efforts are just going to stonewall. Whereas conversely, if your senior leaders are really engaged about it, that's going to be fine. But if the dev team would rather go away and do completely different work, then it's not something that's going to be taken very seriously. And the accessibility work then will be slapped down. So at the end of the day, it really comes down, as I said very early on in the piece, to getting people in the room. And getting people in the room takes many different forms. It can take the form of making sure that you're hiring people with disabilities. And by the way, we're 20% of the population. So if you're telling me that you've got no people with disabilities working in your organization, you're either wrong or lying. And once you've done that, it's also about getting the non-disabled people in the room and making them understand why this is important and how it can be helpful to them in terms of their goals. Because I'm going to be honest, opening up our website to the 20% of the population that couldn't access it before actually looks pretty good on your resume if you're talking to the right people. And then it becomes as well about getting the senior leadership on board and saying to them, not just this is going to bring a benefit to our business, but also this is the right thing to do. And in general, if we do this well, we are going to get a lot more benefit out of it. And it's a hard roadmap and it won't always work. And sometimes when you find that the organization isn't on the right track in terms of accessibility, your best option will be to go and get a job at somewhere that does appear to be on the right track. But if you've come into a new job and you can see that you have senior leadership that are willing to listen, and you have that really motivated core of people who either want to solve problems or want to make it better for people or believe that there's a genuine business case there, and if you either have people with disabilities already hired into your organization or believe that you might be able to influence the hiring process, even if it's just subtly, to sort of tip those scales, then here is my basic roadmap to building a culture of accessibility in an organization from the ground up. And thank you very much for having me all the way from Australia. It has been lovely to speak to you today, and hopefully I will see some of you around again.
Thank you.
That actually
So just to mention as well that we do have Slido. If anyone's got any questions from the talk from Florian or Dawn. And now, last but definitely not least, speaker is Ben Mustel-Rose, who is a software engineer in test on BBC iPlayer. Ben will be focusing on 2 examples of assistive technologies created by big tech companies, screen readers and AI-powered apps. We're going to be learning how they came to be, what effects they've had on the industry and their users, and what might happen in the future if their progress is left unchecked, and what you can do to help. So I'm very excited for this talk.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate being given the opportunity to talk. I've got quite a lot to say, so it's probably best that I just jump in and get started straight away. So I am Ben Mustel-Rose. You can follow me on Twitter at @BMustelRose if you like. And my day job is a software engineer. So I work at the BBC, where we build iPlayer for iOS and Android. But I'm here to talk to you about something slightly different to iPlayer today, and that is big tech companies, so Apple, Microsoft, Google, so on and so on. This idea of big tech companies building assistive technologies, in contrast to how things were previously, where assistive technologies were often built by smaller, more specialized sort of boutique companies, so to speak. When I say assistive technologies, that can cover a wide variety of things, but some of them will be things like screen readers, that might be built into iOS, for example, like VoiceOver, but some of them might be more like apps, so assistive apps that big tech companies have created to try and help blind people such as myself. And these are often viewed as revolutionary, real sort of a real revolutionary advancement when it comes to accessibility. And I probably agree. I mean, I know my iPhone has changed my life, so I don't really want to try and convince you otherwise in this talk. What I would really like to try and do, though, is maybe sort of ask whether this built-in approach is quite as good as a lot of people make it out to be. I don't really want to tell you what to think. I just want to try and provide a slightly different perspective around whether these interventions by big tech companies are actually benefiting us or not. Because for me, there are some fundamental questions around these approaches that I feel that as a community and as a society, we really need to ask, but unfortunately, we're not doing it at the moment. I suppose before we get started, just a little disclaimer that I'm going to be looking at mainly screen readers and apps from a blindness perspective, as I'm totally blind myself, so it's what I know the best. So I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about screen readers. There are many built-in screen readers across multiple devices today, and I'd like to sort of maybe challenge the idea that this is as good as a lot of people make it out to be. But in order to understand where we are today and where we may end up in the future, we need to go back a while. And so I'm going to take you on a very brief history lesson. And we're going to start at 1998. So this was the year when Who Wants to Be a Millionaire graced our airwaves for the very first time. It was also the first time that we discovered the use of auto-tune en masse. Thank you to Cher and the song Believe. And it was also the year when I joined millions of children in begging their parents to buy me a Furby for Christmas. But more importantly than all of that, arguably, was that this was the year when we purchased our first family computer. And this was a really big deal for us because we weren't a well-off family. But over a few years, we managed to save up, I believe, about £1,000 until we had this computer. And it worked quite well. It worked quite well for most people. The only person that it didn't work well for was me, because I couldn't see the screen. You've always got to have that sort of one awkward child, really, haven't you? And so my parents did some investigating, and they sort of spoke to people who understood tech, and they weren't really making that much progress. There weren't really any settings that could be tweaked or programs that they could run to make this computer accessible to me. And ultimately what they found was that they were going to have to purchase a screen reader from a specialized company that would read the screen contents to me, and it was going to cost an extra £1,000. So £2,000 all in all for an accessible computer. And we just couldn't do it. That was out of the question. And so I made do. 2016. I can't remember much about what happened in 2016. I seem to remember there was some kind of political event, but I don't remember the details of it too well. I don't think it got a huge amount of media coverage, so I don't think it could have been that significant. But it was a significant year for me, because this was the year when I really started settling into my job at the BBC. And like most other people in my team, I'd been given a Mac as my sort of daily driver. And for anyone who doesn't know, Mac OS includes a built-in screen reader called VoiceOver. So this is available to me at no extra cost. It's just part of the OS, and that is the case for many Apple products, actually. But where it gets kind of interesting is that, in my experience, VoiceOver is good enough for most people, but not really good enough for someone like me who needs to do more technical tasks, which is really unfortunate, because there's no alternative to VoiceOver on macOS, broadly speaking. And that makes it really tricky in a professional context, because if there's something that I need to do on a Mac and it doesn't work with VoiceOver, I'm just not going to be able to do it. And that's it. And that's really hard to justify when you are trying to use a piece of technology in the workplace. And so you end up in this really unfortunate situation where, by creating VoiceOver and giving it away for free, Apple have actually excluded me from their macOS platform. You know, VoiceOver isn't good enough for me. I can't use it professionally, but it is good enough for lots of other people, and it's free. So bearing in mind that it's free and good enough for most other people, there's no incentive whatsoever for a third party to come along and make something that will work for me, because I'm just far too niche. There are people who use Macs at the BBC who are totally blind like myself, who have slightly different workloads. But for me, it's not possible. So let's have a look at Windows. What's happening on Windows at the moment? Well, it's kind of a different landscape really. So there are quite a few different options still available. You have Narrator, which is Microsoft's built-in screen reader. You have NVDA, which is my daily driver. So that's a free and open source screen reader. And you've got lots of commercial offerings as well, like JAWS, Zoom Text, and Supernova. I think it's important to point out here that one of the things I've learned over the years is that in order to be a productive blind person, particularly when you're in education or employment, you really kind of need more than one screen reader. You know, screen readers are incredibly buggy pieces of software, and conceptually the whole concept of a screen reader in relation to a GUI is actually just one massive hack in my opinion. So you need to have more than one. And even though the commercial offerings are still incredibly expensive, which of course is extremely unfortunate, at least it does allow me some choice. As a platform, I can use Windows at work because if something doesn't work with NVDA, I can open up another screen reader and it might not work, but at least I'll have a good chance. I'll have a fighting chance to get the task done that I need to get done one way or another. But let's look at what could happen in the future under Windows. Now, of course, we don't really know what will happen in the future, and we don't have too many data points to draw any comparisons with. But let's imagine what it might look like based on what's happened with macOS. And so I think the one that we really need to watch here is Narrator, because Narrator has been improving incredibly quickly over recent years. It's already very good. And actually, for some people, it's probably good enough to be their primary screen reader if they're just a basic computer user. And so what will happen when that becomes more commonly known then? Well, what I think will happen is that your universities, your companies, your governments will realise all of a sudden, actually, you know what? We don't need to pay £20,000 for a site license for JAWS. We can just get our users to use Narrator or install NVDA because it's free. You know, why would you choose the paid option if there's a free one available that's perfectly good? And of course, unfortunately, what will happen as a result of that is that the money will dry up, and these commercial screen readers barely make any money from home users. The corporates and the governments are their main customers really, and so unfortunately, over time, the money will dry up and they will go out of business, and of course, their products will cease to exist, thereby decreasing the market for screen readers on Windows. And well, what about NVDA? Because it's free and it's open source, and yes, NVDA are privileged to have an incredibly loyal team of volunteers working on their product, but actually all of their full-time employees are funded by grants, and you kind of have to wonder how long those grants will be available if the mood switches such that people think that Narrator is all of a sudden good enough. And so it's hard to put a time on this, but I suspect that in around about 5 years, maybe, we will come to learn that there can be only one, and you may well end up in a situation where Narrator is the only screen reader on Windows that is available to me. And if that works out in the same way that it has done on macOS, that's really, really worrying, because it's probably not going to be good enough for what I need it to do, but it's going to be all that exists. And so all of a sudden, I'm now excluded, professionally at least, from the two main computing platforms that are in wide wide use throughout the industry. And so what can we do? Can big tech companies make good screen readers compared to assistive technology specific companies? I sort of put this question on the slides because I was sort of mulling it over myself, and once again, I don't really have an answer. I think if you look at a screen reader like VoiceOver on iOS, that has proven to be an incredibly revolutionary product, and I'm not entirely sure that you would see that amount of innovation coming from a more sort of boutique and specialized assistive technology company. But having said that, I've reluctantly come to realize over the years that your Apples, your Microsofts, your Googles, your Samsungs, they're probably never going to make a screen reader that is good enough for me as a more technical user. And it's a real shame, but what I think that you'll see is that you'll see overall more blind people than ever in employment, because you've got a greater level of accessibility built into the devices that we'll be using in the future. But I think that that will come at the detriment of some existing career paths. I think that some careers that are currently accessible will actually become inaccessible as a result of this switch to built-in as opposed to sort of external screen readers and assistive technologies. And most worryingly for me, I happen to think that software engineering will be one of those careers that will become inaccessible, which is a very unfortunate place to be. And so what's the CTA, right? What can you do if you're watching this and you don't like the way that things are going based on what I'm saying? Well, I suppose the one bit of advice that I can give you is that if you're part of a team and you're building an app or a service that is going to run on a platform that has multiple screen readers available, so mainly Windows, please test using these different screen readers. Now, yes, test using the Rater, that's important, but also test with NVDA, and if you can, test with JAWS, ZoomText, and Supernova as well. So that's all I have to say about screen readers, but it's not just screen readers that big tech have been investigating. They've also been thinking about what AI can do to help blind people. So we have to now consider this concept of AI, or artificial intelligence, as an aid for blind people in the context of these big tech companies like Apple, Microsoft, and Google. So this has been going on for quite a while now, and there are a wide variety of use cases that people have come up with. So generating descriptions of images, reading pieces of printed material, and recognizing objects. You are starting to see some dedicated hardware, but it's currently mainly based around apps on existing devices. So if you want to have a little play with some apps and get a feel for how AI is currently being used to help blind people, if you have iOS, you can download Seeing AI, which is free, or if you have Android, you can download Envision, which is a trial. It's also available on iOS too. And so let's have a look at where we are now and what the future might hold. So at the moment, there's a bit of a barrier to entry to using these services. So let's say that I want to read a piece of printed text. So at the moment, I have to take my phone out of my pocket, unlock it, open up an app, wave my camera around until I've got the text read to me, close the app, lock my phone, and put it back in my pocket. So, not terrible, but there's definitely, it's definitely a task in itself. But what's interesting is that you're starting to see a switch to smart glasses. So companies are taking the apps that they've made and porting them to smart glasses instead of just relying on people's phones. And the thing that I find really interesting about that is that I reckon in a few generations' time, product generations, you will probably be able to buy a set of smart glasses that are so well designed and so well refined that it kind of won't make sense for you to ever take them off. You know, they're going to work so well that you may as well just leave them on your face all the time. And I think for me, that's when we're going to see a huge step change in the amount of adoption you see for these technologies. Because if I don't have to decide whether completing a task is worth taking my phone out of my pocket and opening an app and so on and so on and so on, I'm probably going to start using it for far, far more things, probably slightly more inconsequential tasks. But of course, increased integration should hopefully come with increased levels of scrutiny. And there are many different things that we can scrutinize here, but I'm just going to focus on one area for now that I hope illustrates my concerns well. So what are we allowed to see? You should never have to ask yourself that question, but actually we're already asking ourselves that question today, or at least we should be. So I haven't included the exact quote just for the sake of brevity, but I checked this just before I started recording this talk. And if you look at the terms of use of Seeing AI, they say that you're not allowed to use Seeing AI to identify any quote unquote inappropriate images. Now, I suppose my sort of two gut reactions to that are, well, firstly, inappropriate is subjective. It's incredibly context specific, and something that might be inappropriate for one person may be entirely appropriate for someone else. And secondly, that feels like a fairly sensible clause to use if you're developing some kind of website. You know, maybe you're developing some kind of image recognition service that's going to be used by your average consumer. But I think it's a terrible clause to use as part of a service that is going to be used as part of some kind of wearable that blind people might have on their faces that they're going to be using to navigate outdoors. And so to try and illustrate this a little bit better, I'm going to talk about an incident that happened to me pre-COVID earlier this year. I wasn't using any kind of AI at the time this happened, so we're going to go through two different scenarios. We're going to go through what actually happened, and then we're going to revisit it and think about what might have happened if I was using some form of AI as part of some kind of wearable that had some terms of use that weren't fit for purpose. This is a fairly common scenario for me. It was sort of mid-evening, and I was standing at a tram stop in Manchester. I was waiting for my tram, and after a while, my tram came along. So I walk up to a door. I start to get on, but a member of the public sort of puts their hands out in front of me and stops me. And I think, oh no, what's happening here? You know, why are they doing this? And I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail, but the member of the public told me that the person sat nearest to the door that I was about to enter through was engaging in what I would describe as very hard drug use. And so obviously that was a bit of a shock, but I decided that, you know what, I'm just going to not get on this tram. You know, I'm gonna wait for the next one. So even though it was a bit of a shock and it took a little bit longer, I was ultimately able to get home safely. But let's think about what might have happened if I was relying on some kind of wearable and that member of the public wasn't there. So the AI probably sees the tram approaching, and it probably knows which one I want, so it tells me that it's the right one. And it probably knows what the doors of the tram look like, so it might give me a little bit of help in finding one. And let's say that I step onto the tram and I start looking around for an empty seat. But as part of that looking around process, the AI sees the drug use going on. And so I've unwittingly broken the terms of service all of a sudden. And so there are a couple of things that might happen there. The worst case scenario is that my account just gets suspended on the spot because I've, albeit unwittingly, broken the terms of service. Or even even in the best case scenario, the AI will just stop talking to me all of a sudden. And that's really interesting because what's happened there is that it will have made a choice. It will have made a choice that it is designed to make to purposefully not inform me of what is happening, even though that then puts my safety in jeopardy, because I actually really need to know what's happening then more than I might do in any other situation, because I need to make a split-second decision about my safety in terms of whether I want to continue to get on the tram or to get off. But at that point, it shuts down because its terms of use forbid me from seeing the thing that it's just seen. And so, what next? Well, I think we need to ask ourselves as a community and as a society what we're willing to put up with, so to speak, when interacting with these services. You know, should companies be allowed to be gatekeepers of vision? I don't think so. I mean, that sounds really, really Black Mirror-esque to me. That sounds terrible. And you know, these services are often sold as, you know, real sort of liberating solutions that, you know, drastically increase people's freedom. But actually, if all that these services let me see are the things that Google or Microsoft think are appropriate for me to see, that's not freedom at all. In a very important way, that isn't freedom in the slightest. That's just draconian. And so I hope that I've given you some food for thought there. And once again, I don't really have any answers about what we should do about these problems. And even if I did, I might not tell you them anyway. What I really hope I've done is given you some questions that you can ponder once you come away from this event and hopefully come up with some opinions yourself. So I'm sorry I've overrun. Thank you once again for having me. I've really enjoyed putting this together, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the event.
Okay, should I share my screen? Am I host? So thank you, everyone. Can you see my screen? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone, for listening to the talks, and thank you again to our speakers. We're just going to have a quick 10-minute break, should we say, till 8:50. Should we do a 5-minute break? Do you think, Dave?
Do 5 if you want.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll do a 5-minute break until 8:45 your time. So after that, we're going to do a Q&A from the questions on Slido. If anyone else has got any questions, just add them onto there. So it's just Slido/accessibility, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes to do that. Thank you. Hey everyone, so hopefully you can all hear me okay, and we're just back from the break. So we're going to get into questions, and thank you again to the speakers for doing this Q&A as well. So I'm just going to go with the kind of top voted questions. What I'm going to do though, I am going to time it so that just so we don't so we get like chance to ask all the different questions. So I'll probably, when I ask a question, I'll probably just time it to like maximum 5 minutes maybe, or like a few minutes per person. So most of the questions are quite general, it's not for a specific person. So anyone who kind of wants to jump in first, I think just say, or I may ask like a certain person. Does that sound all right, guys?
Sounds good.
Cool.
Sounds good to me.
Cool. So the one of the top voted questions was, how can we better educate developers and designers about accessibility? Who wants to go in first?
I'd honestly say that the main issue, and it was already brought up in chat as well, the main issue that a lot of people face is that just isn't being covered by mainstream developer and design studies. Like, you don't hear anything about accessibility in the computer science course, not really. Same goes for informatics, for UX, for communication media design. It just doesn't come up, and I think that is one of the main things that we need to change. This needs to be a far more talked about thing. It needs to become the new security, essentially.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say I don't have a perspective on how you educate people on it necessarily, because I talk a lot about accessibility so often. I am the education, but I have had a lot of people come to me when I've talked about accessibility at work, who've then said either this was covered a bit and I wish it had been covered more, or this was not covered at all and now I'm learning all of these things.
I think I'd add that in the context of a team, education within a team, it sounds like a bit of a cliche, but I think it's really important to make accessibility accessible. So if you just put, you know, WCAG guidelines in front of people, then they're just going to switch off, because I'm not necessarily criticizing the document, but it's not exactly, you know, sort of 10-minute reading over your lunch break at all. You know, it's very, very dense, and the problem if you do things like that multiple times, people tend to associate accessibility and any other related discipline, you know, with being something that's hard to do. And my experience is that you only get a few chances to get that right. Otherwise, these perceptions linger within the team for a very long time, years potentially.
I like that. Accessibility is in itself incredibly inaccessible for newcomers. Like, it's very high threshold, and the documentation is often very hard to follow if you don't have a, hey, this is a getting started guide to this stuff thing handy, which I think there should be more of, honestly. There should be more resources that cover this in a team setting.
Yes, agreed. If you can give people an in that is simple for them to understand, particularly given that often people don't have personal experience of this, that is hugely helpful. And I'd say I've seen that being really helpful in getting people to switch on and understand accessibility.
Yeah, thank you all for those answers as well. Like, I think starting from the basics is definitely really important when it comes to accessibility. And also, as mentioned, like not making it all about WCAG. That's something I kind of learnt the hard way at the beginning as well, in accessibility. So the next question is kind of similar. So is there any guidance or learning around accessibility for cognitive disabilities? And the person said, I've not found any information about this and would love to learn more. Anyone wants to answer? I know it's quite a generic question. Yeah,
I can probably speak to that one a little bit. So the best resource that I've found for this is the US federal government has actually produced plain language guidelines. I'll find the link and drop it somewhere at some point, that basically cover explaining things and laying out text in a way that's easy for people with both intellectual and cognitive disabilities to understand. The other thing, and this is admittedly anecdotal, but I have a good friend who has a traumatic brain injury, and one thing that they talk about a lot is before they had the traumatic brain injury, and they do software dev, before they had the traumatic brain injury, they never had to look up documentation for anything. Now they do all the time because they don't have that recall. So using plain language and having things documented in a way that people can come back to and easily refer to are probably the two most helpful things. For the documentation, there's not a lot. It's not something people really know about. The plain language guidelines, though, are great.
Thanks, Dawn. Ben or Florian, is there anything you guys want to add?
Just making sure I understand. Are we asking about people with cognitive disabilities learning about accessibility, or are we asking about accessibility for people with a cognitive disability?
From the question, I think, yeah, it's like how to make things more accessible for people with cognitive disabilities.
Okay. Yeah, it's tricky. It has to do with there are tools out there that make this easier. They are mostly meant for dyslexic people. Things like the immersive reader from Microsoft comes to mind. It'll highlight words and it'll be able to read them out loud, and you can look up definitions and things. I think that is a good way to sort of look at the problems that the particular subset of cognitive disabilities are running into with your particular app. I think more than any other disability, this is very much a case-by-case situation. It's very hard to make this generalized.
I don't have a huge amount of experience on this either, but I'll just promote a few things that come to mind. Microsoft have made, it's a few years old now, but it's really stood the test of time well. Microsoft have made an inclusive toolkit. So if you just Google Microsoft Inclusive Toolkit, and I'll drop it in the chat in a bit, that's got some really good sort of really snappy bullet points on how to at least discuss these different types of accessibility. And I know there's a lot of cognitive stuff in there. There's also a really interesting blog post that I read, I think it was last year, from I believe it was Molly Ford Williams, called Go Hack Yourself, which is all about sort of how to test for various cognitive impairments if you don't have them yourself. And then any talks that you can find by Jamie Knight, who is a colleague at the BBC and also sometimes goes by the name Jamie Online. Any talks by him are very good from a cognitive accessibility point of view as well.
And I think Florian is correct in saying that cognitive disability is a really broad and expansive term, because that can cover everything from intellectual disability, which is really a different thing on its own, to things like TBI, dyslexia, dementia. And the way that you would design for all of those things is really different. So general resources, yes, but understand your user base too. Which specific subset of intellectual cognitive disability are you interested in making things accessible for? Because that will change the resources that you would use and the things you need to learn.
Thank you. Just to mention, on the YouTube chat, I've put the Microsoft inclusive design link. They have recently.
Thanks.
I know I beat you, Ben. They have recently put a new booklet, which is Respect in Focus. I used that recently. I think it's new anyway. I recently found it, and that was really helpful. And yeah, I just wanted to say as well, like, I think this is where like user research comes in, helpful when in terms of like cognitive disabilities and doing research with people with different like cognitive needs. That's really helped me when it comes to thinking about like content and design. Yeah, so I'll just go to the questions. So the next question is, having representation of disability in a business workforce is so important. Is there a danger of assuming that they will want to be accessibility experts? So I'll just read that again. Is there a danger of of the kind of representation of disabilities in a business workforce is so important, is there a danger of assuming they want to be accessibility experts?
So I can talk about this a little bit personally. And I think I'm talking about my experiences at the BBC here, but this isn't a reflection on an organisation per se. I think it's potentially a wider issue in the industry. So when I first joined, I was sort of overwhelmed by the amount of opportunities that were available to me. You know, I was working on loads and loads of stuff that I just would never have access to, and all of a sudden I was having these conversations with like Apple and Google and Microsoft. And I was like, wow, that's great, and they were all to do with accessibility, even though my job has absolutely nothing to do with accessibility. And I think what I learned over time, it's one of those things that's really obvious with when you say it out loud with the benefit of hindsight. But the more that you do accessibility stuff, for want of a better term, the more that people do assume that you are here to do accessibility. I remember once I was doing an event. I do a lot of STEM events around teaching kids to code. I was driving to an event with a colleague who I didn't work with directly, and so I was telling them about what I did day to day and what my job was, which is just a software engineer. And we got to the event. They introduced me on stage, and this colleague introduced me as an accessibility consultant, even though I'd spent a good sort of 10-15 minutes of that car journey explaining to him that I didn't do accessibility. And so I think what I've learned, to draw it to a close, I think what I've learned over time is that it's not that you can't do accessibility, but you have to be mindful that is probably going to be someone who's clearly visibly disabled. That's going to be a perception that people are going to have. So you have to strike a balance between, yes, taking these opportunities, sometimes once in a career opportunities, but then also managing that perception a little bit. And colleagues have to just stop assuming as well. But easier said than done.
Don't assume. It's something I can actually really quickly relate to as well. Often I do offer that I can do accessibility for companies when I join them. This is usually because I can see that might be necessary, or might even be a way to get myself hired. It's if I see there is accessibility in a company's DNA, then I might actually play to that and see if that can be a thing I do. But then at that point, I make it explicitly clear that I'm willing and able to do that. That is obviously not the case if you're just a software engineering. I'd be a software engineer, but I will also be doing accessibility work. So in that I have like a dual role, which does happen as well. So it's really depending on the person.
Yeah, I've had very similar experiences. It's why when in my bio, I sort of say I'm an accidental accessibility advocate. And that's because I had to be able to get what I needed at work and to be able to get things done that wouldn't have been done otherwise. But I'm not an expert. I can talk about it from the perspective of someone who is disabled, who needs accessibility, but I'm not the expert on how you fix it. That should be like, I'm a DevOps person. I do pipelines. If you're the software engineer that's fixing the accessibility issues, it's your job to become an expert on it, not mine. And that was something it took me a while to work out, to actually say to people, I'm here as the consultant explaining to you what doesn't work, and I can tell you what needs to be fixed, but how to fix it, that's your job. You have to become the accessibility experts because this is not my field.
Sure.
Thank you. So we're going to just do one more question if all the speakers are okay with that. And then, yeah, you're on, yeah. And then after that, we'll just do the outro and finish off the event. So there's just one more question. It's been kind of asked to Dawn specifically, but you can all answer as well if you want to. So just to Dawn, so once general awareness is achieved, how can teams move from we know something is wrong but don't know how to fix it to we know how to fix this?
I'm actually the worst person to answer this question in existence, probably. And it calls back to what I just said, that I'm the accessibility advocate. I'm not the expert on how to solve it. And because it was a matter of, when I started talking about this, I was working in an organization that was about 800 engineers, 800 software developers, engineers. And if I had gone and learned about all of the ways to fix those things for teams of 800 engineers, sorry, that's my blood pressure monitor going off again, I would have got nothing else done. So my strategy for that has been, leave it with them. And if you have people that are passionate enough, they'll do the research and they'll get their head around it. But that is not a strategy that works everywhere. It's a strategy that I had to have for my own self-preservation, so that I got the actual work that I was hired for and that I was interested in done.
Thank you. Ben or Florian, is there anything you want to add to that question?
No, I think everything that I wanted to say has already been said in this case.
I feel myself agreeing with Dawn in as much as I've sort of become a coincidental accessibility expert, you know, who's, well, quote unquote expert. I think there was a deck that I put together at work once where I called myself an accessibility busybody, and that was at the suggestion of a colleague. And I was never quite sure whether they were joking or not. Yeah, I think, well, I mean, the first step in that process has to be learning. So you know, get yourself some devices, figure out what assistive technologies are built into the devices you've already got. Maybe get someone in, you know, initially to give you a little bit of guidance. Maybe that's someone internal, maybe it's someone external. And you know, accessibility, and we touched on this earlier, accessibility doesn't have to be binary, right? You're probably not gonna ship, you know, one, you know, minor version upgrade where everything becomes accessible. Pick something really well, comparatively easy to deal with, hopefully. So, you know, color contrast is a good one. Make sure your contrast is appropriate and not just communicating meaning by color, and then learn from that. So, you know, learn from it in the context of all the different disciplines, you know, because test are going to do accessibility differently to how design will do, and same with dev and product. So make sure, I guess, in the learning process, make sure that every discipline is on board and has the tools that they need to learn about whatever it is you're trying to do. But yeah, it's tricky, right? The reason why we have these discussions again and again and again is because it isn't an easy problem to solve, unfortunately. But you know, it's one of those things where, even though, yes, okay, if you make your product, as Florian touched on earlier, if you make your product accessible for screen reader users, yes, we are unfortunately a minority, a very, very small minority, and you know, that makes it hard to talk about ROI. But once you start your way on that journey, you'll find people who are very, very appreciative of the work that you're doing, regardless of how little it is.
Yeah, I guess my closing comment on that would be that Ben touched on the incremental approach. Anecdotally, I found the incremental approach is probably actually the best way to teach people as well, and to get people to get their head around it, because those small fixes, things like the color contrast, not communicating information only via color, those are things that a lot of people will know how to do anyway as part of their work. And then if you do small things, learning how to solve a small problem is much easier than learning how to solve a really big problem. So if you start with the small problems, you gain some of that knowledge as well that you need along the road that will help you solve the big problems.
Thank you. So I think we're going to close off the event now. So I just want to say, again, a big thank you to Dawn, Ben, and Florian as well. And thank you so much for doing your talks, and for being here today as well, and being part of the Q&A. And thank you everyone who watched and gave questions for the Q&A. We also want to give a big thanks tonight to our sponsors. So Co-op again for the Zoom account, and also MyClearText. And thank you for doing the real-time captions that we've had tonight that you've seen on YouTube. So don't forget to give us a follow at A11Y MCR Manchester, as well as keeping an eye on our Eventbrite page for more details on future events. And as we said last month, we are still learning with these events and ensuring that we make these events as inclusive as possible for all our attendees and speakers. So if anyone has any like feedback or suggestions or criticisms, then we are listening and we are taking it in and we are trying to improve. So you can just kind of DM us on Twitter if you want to, or email us, or reach out to one of us, or reach out on Eventbrite if you want to, just to give us that feedback on how we can improve. So I think that's everything. If I've missed anything, please shout Dave, Chris, or Stu. But otherwise, I think we're going to close off. And thank you again for coming and watching the event tonight.